Before we get into this one, let's be honest about something up front. There's no leaked video of Bill Gates losing his temper over a Linux company in Denver, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you a fantasy. What's actually happening is arguably more interesting than any fake meltdown clip could ever be, because a small, bootstrapped Linux hardware company just proved something the entire PC industry assumed was permanently settled decades ago, and the real story behind it says a lot more about where computing is heading than any fabricated headline ever could. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because this is a story about patience, stubbornness, and 20 years of betting against the biggest software company on the planet. And it just reached a moment that's genuinely worth understanding in detail. Titles like the one on this video exist because they capture a feeling a lot of people have right now. Even if no individual person actually said or did the exact thing implied, that feeling is this. For decades, the assumption inside the software industry was that ordinary people and businesses would always need Windows, that the operating system was simply the unavoidable toll booth standing between anyone and a working computer. What's actually happening in 2026 is a slow, methodical dismantling of that assumption, built not through dramatic confrontation, but through 20 years of quiet, disciplined engineering work from a company most people have still never heard of. Let's start with the company at the center of this, because most people have never heard of System76 despite it quietly operating for 2 decades. Founder and CEO Carl Rochelle started the company with about $1,500 sitting in his own basement. No venture capital, no outside investors, no safety net. Just a bet, a genuinely risky one at the time, that there were enough serious Linux users out there willing to pay for a properly supported Linux-only computer to sustain an honest business built entirely around that idea. Think about how unusual that bet actually was back when Rochelle made it. 20 years ago, Linux on the desktop was viewed by most of the tech industry as a hobbyist curiosity, something enthusiasts tinkered with on old hardware, not something anyone seriously expected regular people or businesses to buy dedicated computers for. Windows had the market completely locked down. Apple had its loyal but comparatively small following. Betting an entire company on Linux desktop users specifically was, by most conventional business logic at the time, a pretty reckless move. And yet, here we are, 2 decades later, and System76 isn't just surviving. It's grown into a genuinely vertically integrated computing company, one that treats open source software as a serious engineering foundation rather than a marketing buzzword slapped onto a product page. The company operates an actual factory in Denver, Colorado, where raw aluminum sheets and billets come in one end of the building, and finished Thelio desktop computers roll out the other, fully assembled, tested, and ready to ship. That's not a small operation cobbling together parts from overseas suppliers and slapping a Linux sticker on the box. That's genuine. Manufacturing infrastructure built specifically around a product category most of the tech industry still doesn't take entirely seriously. Owning that manufacturing process directly, rather than outsourcing it entirely to third-party contractors, gives System76 a level of control over quality and design that most small hardware companies simply can't match. When a company designs its own chassis, machines its own aluminum, and controls its own assembly line, it can make deliberate engineering decisions around things like cooling, cable routing, and long-term repairability that get routinely sacrificed when a company is simply relabeling generic hardware built by an anonymous overseas manufacturer. That level of vertical control also means System76 isn't at the mercy of a third-party supplier suddenly changing a component or discontinuing a chassis design mid-production run, a problem that has quietly plagued plenty of boutique PC builders over the years. The company's product lineup reflects who it's actually building for too. These aren't machines marketed toward casual home users looking for a cheap laptop to check email on. Thelio desktops and their laptop counterparts tend to land specifically in engineering departments, university research labs, and specialized workstations built for demanding computational workloads, developer environments, and increasingly dedicated AI research machines. That's a deliberate, focused market position, not an attempt to compete broadly against every mainstream PC manufacturer on price alone. Here's where things get genuinely interesting for 2026 specifically. System76 walked into this year bracing for serious financial headwinds. The broader tech industry has been dealing with a memory and storage price crunch driven largely by massive data center demand for AI infrastructure, pushing up component costs across the board for anyone building physical computers. System76's own leadership expected this pricing pressure to hit their business much harder than in previous years, forcing difficult decisions about margins, pricing, or potentially even growth plans. Instead, something different happened. Demand stayed strong anyway, and the business kept growing year over year, even while absorbing higher component costs that would have squeezed a lot of companies into retreat mode. For a company selling specifically to developers, researchers, and Linux-centric organizations, this tells you something meaningful about that particular customer base. These aren't casual buyers, comparison shopping purely on price. They're people and organizations willing to pay a premium specifically for a machine built correctly for Linux from the ground up, with proper driver support, proper firmware, and a company standing behind the whole experience instead of treating Linux as an unsupported afterthought bolted onto hardware designed primarily for Windows. If you're the kind of person who finds it satisfying watching a small, stubborn company prove an entire industry wrong through patience rather than hype, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because the technical side of this story is honestly even more compelling than the business side. Let's talk about what System76 actually builds, because the hardware itself is only part of the picture. In-house, System76 develops Pop! OS, its own Linux distribution built on top of Ubuntu, designed specifically to work seamlessly with the company's own hardware lineup. But the more ambitious project sitting underneath all of this is Cosmic, a completely custom desktop environment built entirely from scratch using the Rust programming language rather than relying on existing desktop environments other distributions typically use. Building a desktop environment entirely from scratch is not a small undertaking. It means designing the entire visual interface, window management system, settings framework, and user interaction model that people will actually touch every single time they use their computer, completely independently, without borrowing from existing projects like GNOME or KDE that most other Linux distributions rely on. Cosmic reached its official 1.0 stable release status in 2026, marking the point where years of ground-up development work finally became something ready for everyday users rather than early adopters and testers. What's particularly notable about Cosmic is the choice of Rust as the programming language behind it. Rust has become increasingly popular across the broader software industry, specifically because of its strong memory safety guarantees, catching entire categories of bugs and security vulnerabilities at compile time that traditional languages like C and C++ would only catch after software ships, sometimes not until it causes a real security incident in production. Building a desktop environment, a piece of software that runs constantly and touches almost everything a user does, using a language specifically designed to prevent entire classes of crashes and vulnerabilities, is a serious long-term engineering bet, not a flashy marketing decision. To put that decision in context, memory safety bugs have historically been responsible for a huge share of the most serious security vulnerabilities discovered in major operating systems and browsers over the years. Major technology companies, including some of the largest in the industry, have publicly acknowledged that a significant majority of their most critical security flaws over time trace back to memory management mistakes. The exact category of bug rust is specifically engineered to prevent at the compiler level rather than catching after the fact through testing, or worse, after a real-world exploit. Choosing to build an entire desktop environment in Rust from day one means System76 isn't just building something that looks modern. It's building something structurally less likely to accumulate the kind of security debt that tends to plague software built in older, less safety-focused languages over a long enough timeline. Cosmic reached its official 1.0 stable release status in 2026, marking the point where years of ground-up development work finally became something ready for everyday users, rather than early adopters and testers. Getting to that milestone required building an entire windowing system, a settings and configuration framework, a notification system, workspace and tiling management, and dozens of other foundational pieces most users never consciously think about until one of them breaks or works unusually well. Doing all of that from scratch, rather than forking or extending an existing desktop environment, meant System76 team spent years solving problems that other distributions get essentially for free by building on top of decades of existing GNOME or KDE development work. Industry analysts and Linux-focused publications have started projecting that Cosmic could become one of the most popular Linux desktop environments by the end of 2026, a genuinely notable prediction given how crowded and mature the desktop environment space already is, with long-established options like GNOME, KDE Plasma, XFCE, and Cinnamon each carrying years of accumulated user bases and community trust behind them. For a brand new desktop environment built by a single hardware company to even enter that conversation, seriously, says something about the quality of the engineering work System76 has put into it. There's another detail worth highlighting here too, one that stands in sharp contrast to a trend dominating the rest of the computing industry right now. When asked directly about artificial intelligence integration, System76's leadership has taken a notably restrained approach, politely declining to bolt AI features onto everything the way much of the industry currently seems determined to do. While major operating system vendors have spent the last 2 years aggressively pushing generative AI assistants into every corner of their products, sometimes to significant user backlash, System76 has stayed focused on the fundamentals, stable hardware, clean firmware, and a desktop environment that works reliably without needing an AI chatbot embedded in the file manager or text editor. That restraint stands out even more sharply when you consider the broader climate System76 is operating inside right now. Plenty of frustrated Windows users specifically cited unwanted, aggressively pushed AI features as a direct reason they went looking for alternatives in the first place. Tired of assistants popping up uninvited in menus, settings panels, and productivity tools, they never asked to have modified. A company deliberately choosing not to chase that same trend at exactly the moment a meaningful chunk of its potential customer base is actively fleeing products that do chase it isn't just a coincidence. It's a calculated bet that a segment of serious, technically minded users specifically wants a computer that stays out of its own way, rather than one constantly trying to anticipate what you might want to ask it next. That restraint might sound like a small detail, but it actually reflects a broader philosophy running through the entire company. System76 isn't chasing whatever trend currently dominates tech industry headlines. It's building toward a specific patient vision of what a fully open, auditable computing stack should look like. Hardware designed and manufactured specifically for Linux, an operating system and desktop environment developed in-house with full transparency, and open firmware that users and researchers can actually audit, modify, and redeploy if they choose to, rather than trusting a black box they have no ability to inspect or verify. That open firmware piece deserves a bit more explanation, because it's easy to gloss over without understanding why it actually matters. Most consumer computers ship with firmware. The low-level software that runs before your operating system even loads, that's completely closed and proprietary, controlled entirely by the hardware manufacturer with no ability for outside researchers or even the device owner to inspect what it's actually doing. System76 has pushed specifically toward open firmware. Options, meaning security researchers, universities, and even individual technically capable users, can actually audit that foundational layer of code, verify it's doing exactly what it claims to be doing, and modify it if they have a legitimate reason to. For organizations handling sensitive research or security-conscious workloads, that level of transparency at the firmware level isn't a nice bonus feature. It's often a genuine requirement before they'll consider deploying hardware at all. Richel himself has talked about this larger ambition in fairly striking terms, describing this long-term goal of essentially liberating the entire personal computing stack from top to bottom, hardware, firmware, operating system, and desktop environment, all built and controlled by companies and communities committed to openness rather than proprietary lock-in. He's been refreshingly honest about the timeline involved too, suggesting this kind of full-stack transformation realistically requires something like another 15 years of sustained work to fully realize. That's not the kind of grandiose overnight promise you typically hear from companies chasing venture capital funding rounds. It's a patient, engineering-driven roadmap from someone who's already spent 20 years building toward exactly this outcome, one deliberate step at a time. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that kind of honesty is inside the technology industry generally. Most companies pitching an ambitious long-term vision, especially ones seeking outside investment, tend to compress their timelines dramatically, promising transformative results within a year or two, specifically because that's what investors and headlines respond to. Richel openly stating that a genuinely complete version of this vision sits 15 years out isn't a weakness in the pitch. It's actually a signal of real credibility, coming from someone whose entire 20-year track record already demonstrates a willingness to build patiently toward a distant goal rather than chase quick, exaggerated wins. Consider what full-stack independence would actually mean in practical terms if System76, or companies following a similar model, eventually pull it off. Right now, even, dedicated Linux users typically still depend on proprietary components somewhere in their computing stack, whether that's a graphics card driver, a specific firmware component, or underlying hardware designed primarily with a different operating system in mind. A truly complete, fully open stack would mean every single layer, from the physical chip design decisions down to the pixels rendered on your screen, could theoretically be inspected, verified, and modified by anyone with sufficient technical expertise. That's an enormously different relationship between a user and their own computer than almost anyone alive today has ever actually experienced. If this kind of long-game engineering story is something you find genuinely compelling, drop a like on this video, because the broader context around System76's growth connects directly to some much bigger numbers happening across the entire Linux ecosystem right now. Here's where System76's individual success story connects to something much larger, playing out across the entire computing landscape. StatCounter's most recent desktop operating system data for June 2026 showed Windows sitting at 56.55% of global desktop usage, the first time the platform has fallen below 60% in the history of that particular dataset. Linux, meanwhile, climbed to 4.39%, one of its strongest showings on record. To be fair and accurate about this data, there's real, legitimate debate happening around these specific numbers, and it's worth walking through honestly rather than glossing over it for the sake of a cleaner story. A meaningful chunk of Windows' apparent decline traces back to a growing category StatCounter labels simply as unknown, devices whose operating system couldn't be confidently identified, largely due to privacy tools, modified browsers, and increasingly common bot traffic across the web. That unknown category grew from around 11.3% in September of 2025 to roughly 21.5% by June of 2026, a substantial shift on its own. When some analysts recalculated the numbers excluding unknown traffic entirely, Windows' share climbed back up to somewhere around 72%, a dramatically different picture than the raw headline figure suggested. So which number is actually true? Honestly, both are, depending entirely on what you're trying to measure. If you're asking what percentage of identifiable devices run Windows, the higher figure is more representative. If you're asking what percentage of overall global desktop web traffic Windows is directly and confidently responsible for, the lower figure holds up. StatCounter's own methodology notes acknowledge that monthly figures remain subject to revision for up to 45 days after initial publication, meaning even these numbers aren't fully settled yet at the time of this recording. But here's the part that matters more than the exact percentage point argument, and it's the part almost every credible analysis on both sides of this debate actually agrees on. Even accounting fully for the unknown category distortion, Windows' overall desktop dominance has still been shrinking, gradually and consistently, over the past several years, while both macOS and Linux have been gaining ground simultaneously. One detailed breakdown of the exact same dataset found that Windows dropped roughly 5 percentage points over a 12-month period once you account for methodology quirks fairly. That's a meaningful, real decline. It's just a more gradual, less dramatic story than the most sensational headlines circulating online would have you believe. Linux's growth trajectory tells a clearer, less disputed story, specifically because it's measuring a much smaller starting base where methodology quirks matter less proportionally. Global Linux desktop market share sat at just 2.76% back in July of 2022. By 2025, it had climbed to approximately 4.7%, representing growth of more than 70% over roughly 3 years. The United States crossed the 5% Linux desktop threshold for the first time in June of 2025. India, meanwhile, sits far ahead of the global average at over 16% adoption, driven partly by cost sensitivity and partly by a genuinely strong developer and engineering culture that has embraced Linux for years. A big driver behind this accelerating shift traces directly back to Windows 10's end of support in October of 2025. Millions of users found themselves suddenly staring down a forced choice: buy new hardware capable of meeting Windows 11's stricter requirements, or find an alternative path forward for a perfectly functional machine Microsoft had effectively declared obsolete. Some data, specifically tracking this migration, found that as much as 78% of new downloads for at least one popular Linux distribution during the first quarter of 2026 came directly from users switching away from Windows devices. A striking, concrete data point showing exactly where this new wave of Linux adopters is actually coming from. Gaming has stopped being the automatic disqualifier it used to be too. Valve's own Steam hardware survey recorded Linux hitting an all-time high of 5.33% back in March of 2026, driven heavily by the Steam Deck's continued popularity and Proton's increasingly mature compatibility layer, which now allows the overwhelming majority of Steam's massive game library to run smoothly on Linux without requiring a dedicated native port from developers. That single shift alone removed what used to be the single strongest practical argument keeping die-hard gamers locked into Windows, regardless of how they felt about the operating system itself. Buying Linux hardware has also become dramatically easier over the past few years, which directly benefits companies exactly like System76. Beyond System76 itself, companies like Framework, Tuxedo, and Slimbook all sell laptops specifically designed and certified for Linux out of the box. Even major mainstream manufacturers have started taking this seriously. Both Dell and Lenovo now officially certify select business line laptops, specifically for Ubuntu and Fedora compatibility, a meaningful signal that Linux desktop support has moved from a niche community request to something large enterprise hardware vendors consider worth formally supporting. That shift among mainstream manufacturers matters more than it might initially appear. Official certification isn't just a marketing checkbox. It typically means the manufacturer has actually tested specific hardware components, wireless chipsets, trackpads, fingerprint readers, and power management systems against a specific Linux distribution and committed to providing driver support and firmware updates over time, the same way they've traditionally done for Windows. When Dell or Lenovo puts their name behind that kind of certification, it removes a huge amount of the uncertainty and troubleshooting risk that used to scare away business customers considering a switch, since IT departments can now point to an officially supported configuration, rather than relying on community forum troubleshooting threads to get basic hardware functioning correctly. Government adoption adds another entire dimension to this story that rarely gets enough attention. France and parts of Germany have both announced concrete plans to migrate large batches of public sector computers over to Linux, joining a growing list of government bodies worldwide, reconsidering their dependence on any single foreign commercial software vendor for critical public infrastructure. Distribution maintainers have reported measurable spikes in new installation activity specifically. Whenever a major Windows support deadline arrives, suggesting these migrations often follow a predictable pattern. Users and organizations waiting until they're forced to make a decision, then choosing Linux specifically because the alternative no longer feels risky or unfamiliar the way it might have a decade ago. It's worth noting why government bodies specifically tend to move toward this kind of decision, because the reasoning usually runs deeper than simple cost savings. Public sector organizations increasingly care about long-term digital sovereignty, the idea that critical government infrastructure shouldn't depend indefinitely on licensing decisions, pricing changes, or support policies controlled entirely by a single foreign corporation. Open source software, by its very nature, removes that single point of dependency. A government agency running Linux isn't at the mercy of one company's roadmap decisions, because the underlying code is available, auditable, and modifiable by anyone with the technical capacity to maintain it, even if the original vendor eventually walked away entirely. Now, here's where it's worth pausing and applying the same honest skepticism we used earlier on the Windows market share. Numbers. Online communities reacted to this same June 2026 data with a healthy mix of celebration and genuine scrutiny, and that reaction is worth understanding rather than dismissing. Discussion threads on Linux-focused communities lit up almost immediately after this data became public, and while plenty of comments celebrated the milestone, just as many pushed back hard on the interpretation, questioning whether a several percentage point shift in a single month realistically reflects a genuine mass migration, or whether unclassified bot traffic and measurement noise offers a simpler, less exciting explanation for at least part of the swing. That kind of internal skepticism is actually a healthy sign for the Linux community broadly, not a weakness in the underlying story. A community that immediately celebrates every favorable data point without question isn't a particularly credible one. A community that celebrates for a moment and then immediately starts picking apart the methodology, questioning sample sizes, and demanding better sourcing is a community that actually cares about getting the real picture right, rather than just wanting to feel good about a number for one news cycle before moving on. There's a broader lesson in that pattern worth applying well beyond this specific story, too. Anytime a favorable statistic starts circulating widely, whether it's about Linux growth, competitors' decline, or literally any other topic, the healthiest response isn't blind celebration or automatic dismissal. It's exactly what these Linux communities did here, taking a moment to genuinely interrogate the methodology, cross-reference it against other available data points, and arrive at a nuanced conclusion that holds up even after the initial excitement fades. That kind of careful, self-correcting skepticism tends to produce far more durable, trustworthy conclusions than either uncritical enthusiasm or reflexive dismissal ever could on their own. So where does this leave System76 specifically, sitting at the intersection of all these broader trends? The company isn't just riding a wave of Windows frustration passively. It's actively building the infrastructure, both in hardware manufacturing and in original software. Development through Cosmic that gives Linux switchers somewhere genuinely solid to land once they decide to make the jump. That distinction matters enormously. Plenty of companies can benefit briefly from a competitor's stumble. Far fewer spend 20 patient years building the actual product ecosystem needed to convert that stumble into a durable, lasting alternative people actually want to stick with long term. Think about what Rochelle's 15-year full stack vision actually implies if it continues playing out even partially successfully. A world where the entire personal computing experience, from the raw aluminum in a laptop chassis to the desktop environment, rendering your open windows on screen, could be built, verified, and controlled by companies and communities committed specifically to transparency rather than proprietary lock-in. That's a genuinely different model than the one most people have used their entire lives, where a small handful of massive companies control nearly every layer of the stack you interact with. Daily, often with limited visibility into exactly what's happening underneath the surface. Whether that fully open 15-year vision plays out exactly as Rochelle describes it is genuinely uncertain, and it's worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than promising a foregone conclusion. Building an entire computing stack from raw materials to finished user interface is an enormous undertaking, and plenty of ambitious technology visions have stalled out well before reaching their original timeline for reasons nobody could have fully anticipated in advance. But System76's 20-year track record so far offers a genuinely credible reason for cautious optimism rather than pure hype. This is a company that bet on Linux back when almost nobody serious thought it made business sense, stuck with that bet through 2 decades of industry skepticism, and is now growing specifically because that patient, deliberate approach is finally starting to pay off at exactly the moment mainstream frustration with the alternative has reached a genuine tipping point. That's really the honest version of this story, stripped of any fabricated drama or invented meltdown footage. No software executive needs to lose their temper on camera for this shift to matter. The real story is quieter and, honestly, more impressive than that kind of manufactured spectacle could ever be. A small company built on $1,500 and a stubborn bet, growing year after year specifically by refusing to compromise on the one thing most of the industry treated as too niche to build a real business around. And slowly proving, one Thelio desktop at a time, that an entirely open alternative to the computing stack most people grew up with isn't just theoretically possible. It's already being built right now in a factory in Denver, Colorado. There's a reason stories like this one tend to resonate more than manufactured outrage clips, even without any dramatic hook attached to them. Real progress in technology rarely arrives as a single explosive moment captured on camera. It arrives the way System76's growth actually happened, through 2 decades of unglamorous patient decisions, choosing to build a factory instead. Of outsourcing everything, choosing to write an entire desktop environment from scratch instead of taking a shortcut, choosing restraint on AI features while competitors chased hype, and choosing transparency in firmware when opacity would have been far easier and cheaper to ship. None of those individual decisions look particularly dramatic in isolation. Stacked together over 20 years, they add up to exactly the kind of quiet, durable shift capable of genuinely changing what an entire industry assumes is possible. Before you go, if you want to keep following the real, unexaggerated story behind the biggest shifts happening in computing right now, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more genuine substance behind these headlines than most channels ever bother digging into. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.